Hello everyone and welcome back. In this new lesson we are going to continue the implementation of our reactive loading indicator. So far we have been using the loading service and the loading functionality in general only here at the level of our home component. Let's now switch back here to a larger window and see what happens if we try to open our course dialog component that is also receiving here in the constructor an instance of our loading service. The loading service is the shared reactive service that we are using to have multiple components in our application, such as, for example, the course dialog and the home component interact in a decoupled way with the loading indicator component. Let's switch here to a larger window and see what happens if we try to open the edit course dialog. As we can see, our application crashes. You can see here that the dialog was only partially opened, and if we inspect the console in order to understand what's going on, we're going to see that we have a dependency injection error. We have the message no provider for loading service. And this only happens when we try to open the dialog. So going back here to our course dialog component, because it's opened by the Angular Material Framework, exists in a completely different component tree than our home component. So if we see here our home component and we have a look at the home component template, we are going to see that the template is made of a tab panel and a couple of course card lists. And if we open the course card list template, looking here for the edit button, we are going to see that whenever we click on this edit button, we are going to call the edit course method from the courses card list component. This method is going to instantiate the dialog using the Angular Material dialog service that we are receiving here via our constructor. As we can see, the course dialog component is not a direct child component of the courses card list component. This course dialog component is going to exist in a completely separate branch of the Angular component tree. In order to understand the error, let's have a look here at the course dialog component and see that the loading service that we are trying to inject here is not accessible by the course dialog component. And why is that? If we search for usages of the loading service using Command Alt F7, we are going to see that the loading service is being declared here at the level of the application component. So this is the root component of our application that contains our whole user interface. It's here that we are defining an instance of the loading service. This instance of the loading service that we are creating here will only be available to child components of the application root component. And what does that mean exactly? Looking here at the application component, we are going to see that the service is going to be available to any child components that are reachable via the application component template, including any components that we replace here as part of the router outlet. This is going to include, for example, the home component. So that's why we managed to inject here a loading service without getting any error. Also, any other child components of the home component, such as, for example, the courses card list component, is going to be able to receive that same instance of the loading service. However, any other component in our application that is not a direct descendant of the application root component is not going to be able to access this instance of the service. And that is exactly what is happening with our course dialog. The course dialog, because it's a dialog, it's not a direct descendant of the application root component, so our dialog does not get access to this instance of the loading service. In order to solve the console error that we were seeing that says that there is no provider for a loading service in our component, what we're going to do is we are going to provide to the course dialog a different instance of the loading service. Let's open here the course dialog and let's give it its own instance of loading service by providing here in the providers property of the component the loading service constructor function. So this is going to allow the Angular dependency injection system to create locally at the level of this component a new instance of loading service that can then be injected here in the constructor of course dialog and also in any other child components of this course dialog. So this instance of loading service would also be available here to any child components that we might add to the course dialog component. In order to make sure that we understand that we are effectively creating two instances of the loading service, let's go ahead and add here some logging in the constructor of this class so that we can confirm in the console when each instance is being created. We're going to add a constructor to this class and we're going to say here that a loading service has been created. And with this logging in place, let's now switch back to a larger window and confirm that indeed we now have here two instances of the loading service. So as we can see, the loading service has been created initially when the application has been reloaded, and now when we click here on the Edit Course dialog, we are going to notice that we have indeed a second instance of the service that has been created, and we can also see that the dialog is now working as expected, so we no longer get the dependency injection error that we saw before. So now we have an instance of the loading service at the level of the Edit Course dialog that would allow us to display a loading indicator. But there is only one small problem if we try to use this service instance in order to communicate with the loading indicator that we had installed at the level of our application root component. This would not work. Let's understand why. Going back here to our program, we can see that this instance of the loading service is accessible only at the level of the course dialog. However, the loading indicator that we want to display to the user is visible here at the level of the application root component. This loading component receives here in its constructor an instance of the loading service. Now the question is, which instance of the loading service do we receive here? Do we receive the instance that is injected at the level of the application root component? So this instance here, defined in the provider's property of the application component, or do we receive in our loading indicator the loading service that we have created at the level of the course dialog? As you can imagine, our loading indicator that is present here on the template of the application root component is going to receive the instance of the loading service that is available here on this branch of the Angular component tree. The other loading service in our course dialog is a service that is present in a completely different branch of the component tree, and so our loading component cannot access it. In order to confirm this, we are going to go here to our course dialog, and here, for example, in our constructor, just as an example, we are going to call the loading service and we are going to try to turn on the loading indicator by calling the loading on API. Let's try this out to see if it works. I am going to switch here to a larger window. I'm going to confirm that we have here the first instance of the loading service. And now after clearing the console, let's click here on Edit Course. So as we can see, the new instance of the loading service was created, but we don't see here any loading indicator on the screen. And that's because this instance of the loading service that we are using here inside the dialog is not connected to any loading indicator in this particular branch of the Angular component tree. In order for this instance of the loading service present at the level of the course dialog component to have any effect in our program, we need to connect it to a loading indicator instance. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go to the course dialog component template, and here right below the title we're going to create here a new loading indicator that is going to sit on top of the dialog. Let's remember, our application might have different loading indicators in different components in order to give some feedback to the user about different waiting states of the application. This second instance of the loading indicator that is present here on the template of the course dialog is going to receive in its constructor the loading service that we are defining here on the provider's property of the course dialog component. So right now in our program, we have two loading indicators, one at the level of the application and another at the level of the dialog. Each of those loading indicators can be controlled separately by interacting with its own instance of the loading service. Let's see that now the loading on call that we are doing here is going to indeed trigger this loading indicator here on the course dialog component template. We are going to switch now to a larger window, and after the application has been reloaded, I'm going to click here on the edit button. And this time around, we can see here a new loading indicator that sits on top of the edit course dialog component. We can now use this new loading indicator to give some visual feedback to the user while the save operation is ongoing. So going back here to our course dialog component, we are now going to use the loading service in order to create here a new save course observable. This new save course observable is going to contain the observable that we get back from the courses service whenever we call the save course operation. Now we are going to access the loading service, and using the same show loader until completed method that we have seen before in action, we are going to pass it the save course observable. This is going to give us back a new observable with loading indicator capabilities. So whenever the observable gets subscribed to, the loading indicator is going to be turned on, and whenever the observable completes its life cycle, the loading indicator is going to get turned off. Let's not forget to remove this instruction that we added here in our constructor just for debugging purposes. Let's now try this new version of the application. We are going to open the edit course dialog. We are going to do here a couple of changes. Let's say that we are going to change the title of the course. Let's now click here on the save button, and let's pay close attention to the presence of the loading indicator that gets displayed here. Now the dialog gets closed and we are back to the home component. Because our application is still completely stateless at this point in the course, we had to call the server again in order to get back the updated data. So that's why that second loading indicator that we saw on the screen was present. Let's now quickly see this again in action. I'm going to click here on the edit course dialog. Let's change here the title of the course. I'm going to click save. This is the course dialog loading indicator, and this is the application root component loading indicator. As we can see, the Angular providers property here at the level of each component is a very practical way for creating local instances of the service that we want to be accessible only locally at the level of the component and its child components. And with this, we have completed the implementation of our loading indicator functionality. Let's now continue this ongoing section of the course on reactive component interaction. We're going to be talking next about error handling. So we're going to show you how to build an error messages panel here on top of our application that will easily allow us to display errors that might occur at different places of our application.